Welcome to a very special edition of the MIT Open Documentary Lab's public lecture series. Today, we are presenting a series of conversations to celebrate the groundbreaking new book from our co-creation studio called Collective Wisdom, Co-Creation Media for Equity and Justice, published by MIT Press. I'm Vivek Bald. I am the principal investigator of MIT's Open Documentary Lab, a position that I recently took on from the lab's founding PI, William Uricchio, who you'll be hearing from shortly. I'll just say that one of the unique strengths of the Open Doc Lab is that over the past decade, it has not just been a space for the critical analysis of new technologies of documentary storytelling and the incubation of numerous field-shifting projects, but it has kept alive and brought into this new space a set of key questions about power, inequality, and authorship in the way that documentary works are made. As the book itself makes clear, since the beginning of documentary filmmaking, there have existed rich traditions of collective media making that not only provide alternative models of nonfiction storytelling to the single author or auteur model, but that hold that dominant model to account for the silences, violences, and imbalances in power it reproduces. This book represents one crucial and tangible outcome of years of engagement around these issues, and one that stands to bring them even more powerfully to the foreground as modes of documentary storytelling continue to evolve and expand in the context of rapidly developing new media and communication technologies. I want to congratulate Kat Cizek and William Uricchio, who have been at the helm of this project over the last several years, and all the many contributors to the field study and book, those here today and those who couldn't join us. Thank you for this deeply important contribution to the field. And now I'll pass it on to Kat.
Thank you, Vivek, for the very generous introduction. As you mentioned, Collective Wisdom is a book published by MIT Press. It's based on a field study at the studio and lab, supported generously by MacArthur Foundation and Just Films Ford Foundation. And today we're joined by most of the authors and co-authors in celebration of the release date, today, November 1st. Co-creation is everywhere, and yet it's easy to miss. It's how the internet was built. It forms the backbone of social movements, systems of knowledge, scholarship, and worldviews. In this book, we examine co-creation tools aimed at building the media we need. We gather the voices, works, and learnings of hundreds of folks from divergent walks of life who insist that co-creation becomes wise only when it's tied to equity and justice. This book is an act of co-creation itself. It originally came out of an idea to create a short white paper, which turned into a field study based on interviews with 99 people and 6 group discussions with 67 people. To review the key findings, there was a symposium, there were major rewrites and new additions, and a peer review process involving all 166 people interviewed. And we are in total 14 authors and co-authors. Today, we're going to celebrate with a round robin of 5 conversations between the authors and co-authors. We'll use the broad structure of the book to shape today's conversations: co-creation within communities, co-creation across disciplines and organizations, co-creation with non-human systems, such as planetary ecosystems and artificial intelligence. The 4th panel will explore how co-creation is tied to systems change. And the last panel will explore why now, what next, and some summary thoughts. And then we're going to open up for a larger discussion amongst all the panelists. We really welcome your questions. Please drop them into the Q&A, and we will have time for them at the end of the session. So for this first panel, we're going to get started with co-creation within communities with Juanita Anderson, Maria Agui-Carter, who's very kindly joining us from the road on my phone. So we're going to connect Maria by audio. And this section will be kicked off by a reading from Thomas Allen Harris. Over to you, Thomas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you and William and all of our co-authors inviting all of us and opening up this space. And it's really exciting to be here for this launch. So the chapter I'm going to be reading from is entitled, it's chapter 1, it's entitled, "We Are Here, Starting Points in Co-Creation." And this section is entitled, or subtitled, "In Conversation, Co-Creation and Equity. 5 Media Makers of Color Speak Out." Co-authored by Juanita Anderson, Marie Agui-Carter, Thomas Allen Harris, Maori Carmel Holmes, and Michelle Stevenson. And so, so I'm going to be reading from page 62, text that comes, an excerpt from something I was part of my part of the conversation. Filmmakers engaged in these kinds of movements and co-creation processes have yet to be recognized within academic institutions or even in the field. These filmmakers of color who prioritize a co-creative framework are often placed in a subgroup within mainstream media. We also have to talk about what it is. We also have to talk about what is being legitimized, documented, and studied within the canon. And so part of my part of what was laid behind that statement was the fact that in teaching, I teach a course at Yale, Family Narratives, Cultural Shifts. You know, there are very few texts that really help shed light on the certain co-creative processes. And also there are very few texts that talk about the form of films as opposed to simply the subject matter. And I think about Marlon Riggs and his discussion of the relationship or the tension between form and content. And that idea of, for me, form and content also goes back to the making of the film. And particularly in thinking about this co-creative process of which I've been a part of, and everyone who is part of this, all these co-authors. And so, I have a question for Juanita, who also teaches, and just wondering about how you see this book working in your classes in terms of making filling in a gap with regards to beginning to open up or legitimize a process of co-creation, and specifically within the context of communities of color. You in particular have a long history of working both within African-American communities, but also multiracial communities in terms of your media making, which goes back decades and has been inspiring.
Well, that's a lot, Thomas. And thank you. I was just reflecting as you were reading on this about when I actually started teaching documentary studies. And I inherited a syllabus of films that were predominantly by white men. And I think every filmmaker of color that I know who is now in an academy, who teaches documentary studies has found themselves significantly revamping those documentary studies curricula so that they are inclusive, not tokenly so, but inherently representative of the vast body of people of color who have been creating documentaries and co-creating, working diligently engaged in their communities since our respective histories in terms of filmmaking. So I think that this particular book, I hope, will be a catalyst to encourage scholars, particularly who are not familiar, who have not invested in the time and energy to find out who we are as creators, to really discover and will be inspired to be more representative in our work. But I wanted to ask you a question as well, because in almost the next sentence, you talk about the importance of writing those histories in a way that we're not marginalized. Can you talk about that more? Because I'm also reflecting on the fact that there are so many cinemas that deserve their own courses. And unfortunately, we're often in a position where those become electives and not required in a curriculum. Can you talk about this notion of not marginalizing, but centering our histories?
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate your comments. You know, the courses that I focus on right now are courses, Family Narratives, Cultural Shifts, which it focuses on personal narratives in which people are artists, filmmakers, are making films that mine their family and community archives to tell larger stories. And it also comes out of the work I do around Family Pictures, our Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling. And for me, an essential part of kind of decolonizing the narrative has to do with not centering it around a kind of you know, a mainstream kind of, let's say, yardstick or, you know, or exclusive reference. And so talking about coming from places of equivalency, coming from places where histories are and archives are drawn from those who are able to maintain them and building off of work that's been done before. And also, I mean, there's a, you know, particularly right now, there is a lot of focus on social issue documentary. And that is, you know, seen as, you know, it feels very gendered in some ways, and it feels very, you know, I mean, I was about to say classist, but, you know, I'm speaking from my office here at Yale, but it feels very like, you know, that a lot of those things are not as transparent as they should be, right? And so, so thinking about like the work of Camille Billups, and the way in which she uses this her film Finding Krista to actually talk about ambivalence with regards to being a woman who is expected to fulfill a certain role model with regards to her identity, or a role with regards to her identity, and being able to show that ambivalence and talk about, you know, you know, despite the fact that she comes from an African-American middle class, you know, which is mainstream or white, lower middle class, if not working class. And so that having these kinds of references allows us to expand the notion of, like, you know, these terms that we throw about, and we just assume everyone adopts them in the same kind of way. One of the points that you made was also echoed in Michelle Stevenson's comment in our discussion, where she says, at every stage of the creative process, I'm asking myself a series of questions like, what conversations do I need to have with the editor around character development to avoid stereotypes? And it just made me think about the you know, bringing back the idea of transparency and vulnerability with regards to sharing of the power in terms of representation and telling the story, but also being vulnerable around in that regard as well. And perhaps, Juanita, you know, you made a film, Who Killed Vincent Chin, and you worked, you know, with Asian American filmmakers, you know, and it's become a seminal documentary which was recently broadcast. Could you talk a little bit about, like, you know, how you negotiated that with regards to power? I believe you were a commissioning editor for that film.
I was the executive producer, and I was based in Detroit at the time when Vincent Chin was killed in 1982. And it became quite apparent that this was a story that deserved national attention. And it never entered my mind that anyone other than Asian American filmmakers should be making this film. And I think what really struck me in terms of, because there was a tremendous amount of coverage in Detroit at that time, is that no one, none of the news media, local, national, that were descending on Detroit after the initial sentencing were engaging with the Asian American community. So yes, in a sense, I mean, it actually became a co-production between Film News Now Foundation, the independent production company, and Detroit Public Television. And Christine Choi and Renee Tajma-Pena were the directors, producers on this project. And again, it's about centering the community and the voices and people who not only are invested in community, but also have access and will frame a story as complex of a story as this was, from a lens that is reflective of the communities that they're dealing with.
Thank you so much, Juanita. We actually have to wrap up.
I have to give it one little point in, because this year was the 40th anniversary of Vincent Chin's death, and the Association AEJMC, Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, actually had their national conference in Detroit this summer. And an outcome of that is that they now have a resolution on the table that they're asking at all regional and national conferences to include the Vincent Chin case and stories of Asian Americans that are often overlooked and underaddressed in their resources and tools, so that they can be added to their teaching and curricula.
Thank you so much. Maybe you could put that in the chat later. And I'd like to now pass the baton back to Kat to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Thomas, Juanita, and Maria. We're going to pass over now to the next panel, which is co-creation across disciplines and organizations. And we'll be joined by Sarah Rafsky, beginning with a reading from Richard Lachman. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Kat. So this is from chapter 3, page 150, for those of you who are reading along at home. The chapter is called Estuaries, Co-Creating Across Disciplines and Organizations. The stories we tell, the technologies we use, and the problems we face, and why they matter, are all incredibly complex, bound up in large systems and frameworks. No one person, discipline, or organization has the capacity or knowledge to tackle it on their own. In co-creation, when teams cross disciplinary lines, they embark on parallel paths of discovery rather than ranking one discipline's priorities over the other. It's similar for organizations. In working together, they agree to write new rules on how a project or relationship might emerge. Around the world, artists, journalists, scientists, and institutions are developing forms in which to mix and create ideas and worldviews through crossing and dissolving those boundaries, comparable to the ways that freshwater and saltwater mix in natural estuaries. These experiments tackle the complex problems of the century while enabling inclusivity and diversity and honoring the experience of people from all walks of life. So I wanted to start off by talking about, the chapter actually opens with a discussion of how, say, on a film set, there are specific roles, like a director and a script supervisor and a DOP. And those roles are very well defined, and a team or an organization can function very well across those roles. And co-creation sometimes is about breaking down those hard barriers, and it's about maybe intermixing what roles individuals might have and what they might offer to one another. But a challenge that I find in any kind of project, could be media making, it could be software, it could be a design, is that those roles exist because they prioritize certain values. And those values, say on a film set, might be, when there are defined roles, it's easy to stay efficient in terms of time. It's easy to stay efficient in terms of budget. When you take much more time to build trust, to share points of view across individuals who are part of this project, it takes more time, which turns into more money. And when we expect the same outcomes, when the values that we expect on the other end are, it's still produced in this amount of time, it's still produced for this amount of money, that's a real clash. So, Sarah, I wondered if we could start by, maybe talking about in journalism, which clearly has time pressure in terms of timeliness often, definitely has budgetary pressure in terms of scarcity of resources, how co-creation is kind of factoring in journalism as you see it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for reading that really lovely text. I think it's interesting when thinking about what has happened in journalism over the past 10 to 15 years. And as I write about a bit in the book, I'm sure this is familiar for most people on this webinar, but of course, not too long ago, the term collaboration was something of a dirty word in most newsrooms. This is a field whose economic and cultural model for the past century has rewarded scoops and exclusives and thrived on competition and had established ethical standards that really kept journalists removed from their subjects. What I think has happened, what has allowed the circumstances that have allowed this sort of new approach, particularly considering all the constraints you mentioned, to take hold, is really both external factors that have so dramatically changed the field, and then as well as in response to that, internal factors. I think you cannot separate the increased appetite for collaboration in journalism from the massive technological and economic transformation the industry has undergone in the past 10 to 20 years. On one hand, you had sort of the advent of big data and this incredible plethora of data sources available to create new opportunities for storytelling and research, but just required enormous amount of resources, as you mentioned, and really hands on deck. And then at the same time, you have the economic model for journalism really being decimated, and there are fewer and fewer reporting hands on deck to help with that. And I think that really helped to sort of diminish this competition and the need, if you wanted to make use of these new storytelling potentials that you had to sort of look for help wherever it was. And maybe this existed in a newsroom that was not your own. So I think when we look at sort of formalized collaboration between journalism, that was a huge change. In terms of co-creating between journalists and their subjects, which is another area I explore in the book, I think there are also a variety of reasons for this, but an obvious huge one is just the sort of complete breakdown. Well, I don't want to say complete, but the breakdown of trust between, I think, the media writ large and the public in recent years. And as journalists have grappled with this, a desire to form new relationships with communities who, for a variety of reasons, have felt alienated from media outlets or misrepresented by media outlets. And all of a sudden, a sort of desire to break down some structural barriers and explore with new ways of bringing communities into the story generation process and the news gathering process. And so I think after this sort of dramatic transformation is happening and people start experimenting with this, what happens is that the existing external validation structures, whether it's funders or academic centers or conferences and reports and new funding opportunities, all of those things start to build up around this new form of experimentation and really allow it to sort of foster and develop and move beyond the initial kind of grappling stages. So I think you really need to have one, just sort of these external factors that create a situation where people are willing to experiment with new ways. And then secondly, whatever external validation structures exist in your field, start supporting you and creating structures that allow people to connect and build new processes together, which in turn often leads to some of the sort of more infrastructure issues that allow collaboration to be facilitated and be sort of more frictionless. Just very simple things like sharing data across closed systems, which may seem like an easy fix, actually often is really not. But when more and more people get interested in this and more people are sort of convening and thinking about it and talking about it, new systems, new technologies, new processes develop that allow this all to occur in an easier, more frictionless way, which means you don't have to have the greatest number of resources available to do this kind of work. But I'd love to throw the question back at you and hear how you're thinking about this in your areas of work and study.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting that we try and develop a lot is, you were describing something that's very interesting when, maybe funders are changing, and we know that is a change that needs to happen, and it's supportive for maybe a change that's pushing up. But what I'm curious about, and what we're finding sometimes, is in different kinds of projects, it's kind of one trying to pull the other, and the danger that's there. Sometimes co-creation can be performative. So one example, that happens in Toronto, where I live, was recently we had Sidewalk Toronto, which was, of course, the branch of Google that was trying to redevelop a portion of the city from the internet up, was their tagline. And so in this, they followed a lot of the co-creative principles of design thinking, and they had hackathons, and they had design sessions, and they brought community into their, beautiful, cool warehouse space, and threw some Google money behind the process. But it also was an element of crowd washing. It was impossible to see how those outputs turned into something, not just sticky notes on a wall, but actually turned into shaping the project design. So, for example, there were consultations and events with members of the Indigenous community here. But the advice that the elders gave and the suggestions there was impossible to draw a line between, those conversations and what ended up in 60 pages of a document. So what I'm worried about is some nature where it isn't, it's being pulled by one aspect of this, being pulled by a community, being pulled by, say, a funding organization, but individual designers, individual media makers, individual organizations maybe it's because of pressure, as you were describing, resource constraints, but maybe it's also an approach where we do this kind of one of each thing. Well, okay, I did one of these, did one of these, but so that's some of the worry I have. And I don't know if you have a thought on pushing versus pulling, or both, ideally it's both, but sometimes what can work in a push and pull?
It's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about, you're saying the sort of the performative nature of it. And I think that's definitely true. I remember when I was researching this chapter back when I was at MIT a few years ago, sometimes I struggled with, well, so what is really co-creative, especially when there's certain terms that have sort of been co-opted in the public imagination by other factors, like just this term engagement, for example. Engagement, if you talk to like the social media director at any newsroom, means something probably very different than a lot of people on this call would think, or on this webinar would think of what engagement is. And, so is engagement just the one-way transactional process of, distributing information on social media and hoping people like it or share it or whatever? I think probably for our definitions, that would not be what we're thinking about. But I do think it's very hard when there is no clear definition or understanding. And that's exactly where hopefully, this book, the Co-Creation Studio, all the work Kat and everyone else is doing here helps, because otherwise I think the kind of process you're describing is very easy. If we're not even really all in agreement about what it is, it can be very easy to co-opt.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Sarah. I would love to continue this conversation with you and with everyone here, but I'm going to do my duty and try and keep us on time. So back to you, Kat. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah and Richard. Another key type of co-creation that we explore in the book is this idea of collectively creating between humans and non-human systems. And by non-human systems, we mean animals, plants, water, and artificial intelligence. This discussion will be animated by Sarah Wallazin, William Uricchio, and will be started up by a reading and a setup by Amelia Winger-Bearskin, who is coming to us from a live audience at the University of Florida in Gainesville today. Hello, Amelia.
Hello, Kat. We're so excited to be here. Some of our members of our audience have won a copy of the book, and we're really excited to be a part of this awesome event online. So here's the quote that was selected of mine from in my chapter to read, and it goes like this. With decentralization, storytelling, I'm charting the history of the type of storytelling that I'm seeing that is most popular among the younger generations. It's created through different online platforms, such as VR Chat, Rec Room, AltSpace VR, indie games, as well as platforms like Roblox and Minecraft. People are telling long-form, complex narratives from hundreds of people's perspectives that are all participating in a story. And that is a more similar corollary to the way in which my community, the Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma, Haudenosaunee, or you may know us as the Iroquois, would tell stories. It's also the way that I approach data storytelling just generally. For example, in my project, Talk to Me About Water, an Indigenous-led collective, our goal is to assist diverse audiences to have playful conversations about water. We are a group of water data scientists, developers, artificial intelligence and machine learning scientists, and artists and storytellers who use water data as the backbone of our generative conversations and storytelling mediums. We are hoping to help more people feel fluent in water conversations using public water data. Water is a huge, monumental, fundamental, amazing thing. Because of that, most people, when I strike up a conversation about water, will first tell me all of the parts of the water story that they don't know. But you know, even us water scientists are humble on this. We are all learning, and you know what? No one knows precisely how the climate crisis will pan out in the near future. But we all know that water will be the center of that story. So I think it's important to bridge the gap between water scientists and the general population so that we can begin to tell water stories and address the global water crisis. It is said that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And this is the same way with the water crisis. It will be a crisis for all of us one day. But currently, those shouldering the most of this burden are the global indigenous, the water protectors seeking to stop the extraction and pollution of their ecosystem. It feels very far away now, but their water is our water or will be soon. And if we don't listen to them, it's like we're ignoring a message from the future. Part of Talk to Me About Water is also bridging that gap for those who are experiencing the water crisis more acutely, to hear from them unfiltered. And that's the end of my portion. And I wanted to reach out to William and Sarah, who will have further questions and responses. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amelia. And yeah, your work with data storytelling and Talk to Me About Water, to me, underscores the urgency of co-creation as a way of reconciling human and non-human systems. And I use the word reconciling pointedly as opposed to dominating or exploiting, which are the currently, alas, the terms that are generally used in those relationships. This is particularly resonant in those sectors posing existential challenges to us, like the climate crisis. The scale and complexity of the problems facing us can best be dealt with by working not only with a wide range of human actors, from scientists and experts on the one hand, to the people in the trenches, the people living every day with the trauma of these problems, but also with nature as a partner. And these non-human systems, like nature, we have to respect, we have to learn from, and find ways to co-create with. Co-creation, and one of the things we really drill down on in the book, is as old as our species. And its wise application offers ways to circumvent some of the abuses that have led us to this kind of crazy impasse that we're in. And even though co-creation with non-human systems remains speculative, difficult to get a grip on, and sometimes, there have been some exciting and thought-provoking experiments that the book documents, and that I think Sarah is going to tell us something about.
Thanks, William. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think what's so important about co-creation with non-human systems is that it's a recognition of different types of intelligences. There's this quote that I love from the book that I'm just going to read from Jason Lewis, who is a digital media theorist and artist. And he says, "The human brain is a station on the radio dial, parked in one spot. It is deaf to all the other stations, the animals, rocks, trees, simultaneously broadcasting across the whole spectrum of sentience." And I think that's a really powerful quote and concept, because if, I think we're starting to learn that, there are many kinds of intelligence. Back when, in the 80s, Howard Gardner talked about multiple intelligence and, that there's something beyond the IQ intelligence. And I think we're at another point where, indigenous people have had this co-creative relationship with nature because there's as William said, deep respect and a recognition of different types of intelligence, tree networks and what have you. And that that if we're going to solve world problems, we need to co-create, which deeply respects and has deep listening of different points of view. So I think that's really important. I also think there's an example that I was going to give that William's alluding to, and that is Agnesia Current. She's a wonderful artist who really looks at collective authorship, and she works with non-human systems. And she has this wonderful project with termites where she gives them mounds of sand, and it's in the book, and they have to create their own mounds, or she gives them sand and they create their own mounds, but she's watching them and she's watching their collective work. And again, sort of pointing to the fact that there are other ways of working besides just how humans work, and that these systems are, systems that we can study, that we can learn from, that we can co-create and collaborate with. And in our research of AI systems, we also saw a lot of artists who, some were like, no, the AI is just a tool, and others who said, no, it's a true collaborator. And I listen, and this AI system gives me something I don't expect, and it enhances my work, and it's a relationship. And then the third thing I just wanted to say, and this kind of goes back to Amelia's original reading about collective authorship. And with these systems, you can, it really is a recognition of collective authorship. And that's, we've always created things with collective authorship. And even now, like if we think about AI systems and the data they're pulling, the artwork back at Christie's that was recognized as an AI generated system, it had, it used 15,000 portraits. Someone made those portraits. So it's also really interesting and speculative to think about these different, issues that these AI systems bring up, and then also looking to the past and all of the knowledge we have about collective authorship. So I'm going to pass it back to Amelia or William.
Well, I was just going to say, to jump in, Amelia, that one of the things that strikes me at this moment, I mean, we're seeing very close elections in, Brazil, Israel, the United States, places that aren't having elections that maybe would benefit from them. And in what we're seeing in so many places right now is a turn to the single strong man who can fix the problem. And this really is a robust alternative to that. It offers ways for us to work both together as humans and, again, to pick up what Amelia was talking about, to even reach beyond us as a species and think more holistically and inclusively about the world around us. So it's a really fraught moment. And I'm so glad, I'm really depressed about that state of those many parts of the world, our own bit included, but also glad that the book is coming out now because it seems to offer a bit of an alternative. Amelia, any?
Thank you so much for that. And it's very exciting to see all of the new ways in which people are leveraging different ideas and technologies. My group Talk to Me About Water also has created a water DAO, and we're looking at ways in which you could move past just one person, one vote is often the first way that people understand DAOs, which of course are Web3 and blockchain enabled. But another interesting process that we've thought about is how do we make sure that we represent a non-human systems? How do we represent water as having rights or having its own defensible systems? How do we understand the environment as also having voting blocks and DAOs? And so part of what we're researching in the Water DAO is how we can use Web3 and decentralized technologies to think about water systems, since water is decentralized, and yet all of us are using the same water in the entire world, right? It's one system, it's water system. And so we're looking at how we can understand that through decentralized terms. And Sarah, I think we have a couple more minutes if you wanted to respond to that as well.
Yeah, no, I find that fascinating to think about just, who has rights and who, has authorship and what have you. And I was curious too, in sort of your work, if in the decentralized, sort of the decentralized storytelling, if you could put that back and think about that in terms of the AI systems. And, I talked about AI systems, machine systems revealing human systems, and that there really is this collaboration between them. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, as we know, there are no artificial intelligence systems that are not designed by humans and informed by human systems. It's more about how we choose to weight and measure those systems. Often we know that the limitations are that AI and machine learning systems are backward looking. They look at the data that has already been collected to project a possible future. And we know that there's missing data sets, there's skewed data sets. We know that they have bias. We also know that machine learning and artificial intelligence can actually be one of the most powerful tools to understanding that bias. And so if we understand and harvest and connect and collectively seed and weigh those data sets, we have an opportunity to leverage a new technology to make positive change in the world. And thank you so much, William and Sarah. And we'll pass this back to you, Kat.
Thank you so much, Amelia and Sarah and William. And speaking of democracy and systems, I just wanted to reference Amelia's work on wampum.codes, which really explores how, as we move forward with technology, sometimes we decouple it from the moral systems that created them. And your call for coding in equity and justice back into our democratic systems, which were borrowed or perhaps stolen from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the American system, needs to bring back the codes within which they were created. And on that note, really, this speaks to systems change, that co-creation is only co-creation when it's tied to equity and justice and those codes of wisdom. And this next conversation will be between Mary Carmyle Holmes, beginning, as well as Louis Messiah, and beginning with a reading from Il Weaver of Detroit Narrative Agency. Over to you, Il.
All right. What up, though? My name is Il Weaver. My pronouns are they, them. I'm here on Anishinaabe stolen land here in Detroit, or Wawiyatanang. And I'm so grateful to be here with all of you and to be in conversation with you, Mayori and Louie. I'm just going to set us up a little bit first by shouting out Detroit Narrative Agency. What up, y'all? I'm representing for the team. I'm a co-founder of DNA, but no longer on staff. So big shout out to the co-directors, Ryan and Cornetta, and to Raven and Cass, and all the amazing good folks we're working with closely, including Juanita. I'm really grateful to represent the team with this work that we did together a few years ago with Kat and all of you at the Co-Creation Studio and Open Doc Lab. So this is a little excerpt from Chapter 5, the Field Guide, Risks and Lessons of Co-Creation. Lesson 2, Manifestos and Statement of Principles. And the section is a conversation about the benefits of community benefit agreements, or particularly cultural community benefit agreements. So this is a quote that I have in page 253, where I said, Grace Lee Boggs would often say, politics in command. We end up running the risk of our politics falling to the wayside to make certain economic decisions or logistical compromises. And so because there's systemic exclusion and divestment from our communities, we end up making those compromises. So then how do we proactively put politics in command? And just to add another little Grace quote before I kick it to you, Louie, I have this little crane from when Grace turned 100 years old. We made 1,000 paper cranes with different quotes from Grace to share at the Allied Media Conference that year. And I keep this one on my altar, and a quote on it is, any group that achieves power is not going to act differently from their oppressors as long as they have not confronted the values that they have internalized and consciously adopted different values. So that's from Grace Lee Boggs as well. And so on that note, I'm just so inspired by both of your work, Mayori and Louie. It's so central to, you know, my formation as a media-based organizer and all the work that I do as a media maker and here in Detroit. And so wanted to ask you, Louie, if you could start us off with a little bit of how you operationalize and integrate your values and politics and principles into the amazing work that you do.
Well, thanks so much, Il, and it really is wonderful to be in communion with everyone, with Il and Maori, and in some ways, I also really thinking about collective wisdom in the chapter that it really feels like Amelia Winger Bearskin should also be here because she really is in this chapter. Because yes, it's about system change, but it's also I think about institution building, and because system change, I think it's extraordinarily important to be aware of the deficits and really the violence of the systems, but it's also really important to be thinking about what we create institutionally and structurally to allow us to do the work. And so that's kind of a place of beginning. And the other place of beginning is recognizing those voices in our community that really can guide us. It's not coincidental to me that you quote Grace Lee Boggs, because I think Grace Lee Boggs was one of these people, and I should say is one of these people, because her voice and influence stays with us. But I think within all of our communities, there are these visionaries, and sometimes they're visionaries without portfolio, without degree or whatever, that can guide us, and we really have to listen and really be open and cherish them. I think of the work at Scribe Video Center, which where I am now, it's really about people, and for a long time we really didn't have much in terms of physical facility, but it really was about people working collaboratively, people sharing skills, people figuring out ways to build from each other, and then but also not being confused about the work, the creative work, the media work, and not seeing it as being defined as in the way that the economic system really looks at media as this this commodity that as opposed to something that can actually help build the society in a much broader way. When I think of institution building here in Philadelphia, and at this point I really want to say nationally and internationally, I do think of the work that Maori Holmes has done with Black Star. And I guess my question of Maori is, as you created Black Star, I mean, what were the forces that sort of led to your mode of operation so that Black Star does exist within the broader kind of media world, but it also has a very, very specific place in terms of community building. So what were your models, and what were the factors that sort of guided you in the sort of pushing, making Black Star happen?
Thank you, Louis, for that question. And I mean, I think it's funny that you both are in this session, because the two organizations that we start out, being directly inspired and employed and, participants of our Scribe and Allied Media projects. And so thinking about the early days of Allied Media Conference, but then looking at how the organization grew from that conference, I think is definitely a direct model. Black Star starting as a festival, and then the organization emerging afterward. I personally have been working in arts nonprofits, often adjacent to media making or theater making, my entire life. And so I've developed a lot of opinions and ideas about what has worked and what's not worked. And one of the things we've been thinking about as Black Star as as an institution, concretizes. I mean, it still feels very in its early formation. We're moving into our 4th year in January, and so much of it is not only thinking about the ways in which we're supporting media making in a different way, we're also trying to form an organization in a different way as well. And so I think your initial question, Il, about values and thinking about the quote from Grace Lee Boggs is that, as best we can, we're trying to sort of like utilize the tools that exist. We're trying to like shift the ones that we can, and then also, rest, you know what I mean? And so it's been a very like complicated and not sort of direct process of thinking about those things at all times. But we are trying to do both things. I think the interesting part for Black Star specifically is been how do we acknowledge the sort of for-profit media industry, which I think in this moment is employing more of our folks in a way that has not happened before. And that's a very real material concern that isn't to be ignored, right? Like people are working in ways that they did not have opportunities to do so, which means there are, financial implications, there's exposure implications, practice. And so being adjacent to sort of Hollywood, with a capital H in that way, and other, Louis, thank you for acknowledging we are seeing ourselves as international, but thinking about how our, artists who live in Europe are also working in ways that they hadn't before, and in Southern Africa, and just the ways these industries have sort of expanded is very different than 20 years ago, even when Il and I met and we were like making our little films that were maybe seen by 100 people. The opportunities that exist today, as everybody knows, are just so very different. And so we've been trying to not only like focus on that space, but also think about, I think what we would have called community media, and Louis, which I think you have had a very strong hand in defining, right? Not necessarily creating, but definitely defining how it can and should look with the work that you've been doing. And I don't have any answers at all. I mean, I think we've just been trying our best to create sort of bridges between all of these spaces and not be closed to any either. And just always trying to think about, we hope that we're coming from an intersectional space. I hope that Grace would be proud. Like we feel like we think about Tony Cade, we think about, Belle, and we're sort of like at every sort of project commencement, sort of thinking about what is the goal and how is it, reflecting our values. And so those things are there. And then there's also the artist goals, right? We're also like, does this look good? Does this, does this have rigor? And so trying to balance those things at all times are just sort of that, how we're trying to build an institution. And also not expecting that the institution is permanent either.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's kind of like what any liberation work, like you're doing it for the sake of that larger politic and liberation movement, and the form that you take might transform, and that's what's most important. But at the same time, these institutions that both of you have built have been such cornerstones to keep us grounded, and such compasses and North Stars for all of us. So thank you for all you shared. I'll just share a little bit about like the ways that relates to Detroit Narrative Agency's work. And even this chapter is about cultural community benefits and how we learn from anti-displacement and organizers who have, negotiated community benefits, which often are co-opted in many instances, as the book lays out, but sometimes can be used to fight for the benefit of communities and the politics of communities to be at the center when there is development using our public resources and good. And so we took that same approach to creating agreements between collaborators, even with MIT when they came to work with us on this research project, and that is featured in the book as well. And then what's most exciting recently in my new role in DNA, I'm no longer on staff, no longer in leadership, but as an advisor, co-founder, I've continued working with DNA on this awesome project called Reimagine, where we're really thinking about applying cultural community benefits principles, meaning starting with values and politics and principles to guide how we create legal agreements for the formation of legal entities for media projects, for every contract that is often copied and pasted from a Hollywood standard legal contract, and instead reforming it, reshaping it to align with our values and our politics. And on that granular scale of tiny, low budget media production, how do we start practicing more agency, more equity, and more not just collaboration in the content, but in the process and even the operational logistics of how we create media together, because that's the details that often get overlooked and then replicate the injustices that we're hoping to counter. And so I'm really excited about the Reimagine project. It's up on the DNA site. I could share a link at some point. And it's also connected to this larger resource that I saw dropped in the questions by Anna, which is the Doc Accountability Working Group, Doc Accountability Toolkit, which is so amazing. And so DNA has been in conversation with DOG about that work. Definitely check that out. And I've also been practicing it now that I'm working on, different media projects with Sawatu Salama Ra on an incredible project that Mayuri, you presented one of our earliest iterations of, documenting her story. And so we've been testing out the Reimagine curriculum and framework with Sawatu and other media projects DNA is supporting. And we're thinking about, how do we do these unorthodox collaborations? And one of the exciting things that's happened is we're working with, Sawatu, as well as journalists from the Detroit Free Press, who are setting new precedents to how they're collaborating with someone who would be considered a subject to be more of a collaborative, co-producer, co-director of a film that will also, be featured in their paper, but or on their website, but also is being created as this project to explore how we implement our values into the process when people are criminalized, when people are vulnerable to not have agency, to not be able to control their own story. How do we center their voices? So that's a little bit of how we're doing that through our projects. And I'm just so grateful, Louis and Mayuri, for all your visionary, brilliant work and to be in connection with you on this panel. Thank you for bringing us together, Kat, and I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Mayuri, Louis, and Il. We're going to close out in our fifth panel, which is about why now and what next. And this is going to be kicked off by William. Louis is going to stay on the line, and I'll join for a quick wrap up. And then we're going to open up to the panelists, all panelists. And we also invite your questions. Please do drop them in the Q&A. If we have time, we'll get to them. Thank you. Over to you, William.
Okay, thanks, Kat. And actually, the reading I'm going to do is a nice follow to the discussion we just had with. It comes from the conclusion of the book, page 298. The many voices gathered together in this book are in harmony when they say that co-creation only becomes wise when it is bound to equity, justice, and respect. And while those terms are lofty, going on abstract, makers and communities have found ways to concretize and operationalize them through techniques ranging from deep listening to community benefit agreements. Wisdom from this perspective is necessarily collective and embedded in the larger social fabric. The disaggregation of decision-making from the social, as well as the privileging of singular metrics such as profitability and control, have led directly to some of the greatest threats to survival. What to do? More of the same is fast losing its value as an operating logic, and a little wisdom can go a long way in terms of helping to reframe priorities. The inclusivity of the social offers ways to build trust and solidarity. It is no wonder that methodologies related to co-creation are blossoming across disciplines, from architectural design to placemaking to the sciences. Duke Redberg's question is it wise needs to be bumped to the head of the queue. And that's the quote. And I think with that, I'm going to flip it to Louis. Yeah, and I guess this quote really goes at that tension in a way between the lofty aspirations we have and the needs to implement it, the needs that a center like yours really, makes concrete and operational every day. But any reactions or comment?
I mean, that the trilogy of equity, justice, and respect. I actually don't think. I think there's another element, and I'm not Pollyanna-ish, but I think love is really very, very important. In that the reason, if it's just equity, respect, justice, and respect, it feels like duty, and it feels like. But there's got to be this belief in our community, belief in each other, and so I think love has to be really part of one of the social criteria that kind of guides co-creation. I'm not anyway, and I think I think we can understand what love is. But yeah, I do think that thinking of the title of collective wisdom, I think the wisdom is really as important. To really be thinking and to have criteria as we go forward. I guess. One question, and I don't want to stray too far, but a question for both Kat and you, William, is I think what you've put together, and I know what we've contributed to, but what you really have put together, Kat and William. What are ways that this knowledge can be shared outside the academy? What are things? How do we? Because it really feels like there's got to be ways that those of us, and I'm connected to the academy in some ways, but we've got to really think about ways that this kind of approach can be shared outside the academy. So Kat, what are your I'm gonna turn it over to you. What are you thinking about? Because, and I should say one thing: the energy that Kat has put into really thinking about sharing this work, I just find remarkable. So many people, so many filmmakers make a film, and when it's finished, they count on some sort of system. Or so many people writing books, they write a book and they think the system will take care of it. But Kat really has thought about, okay, we've got to figure out ways that this is going to be shared. So I really want to know about the non-academy. What are your thoughts? What are the plans? The community. Yeah.
Tough question from Louis, thank you, but also a very generous offering of love as something to really center in this work. So thank you for that, Louis. It's interesting because the panel is so, and the authors and co-authors, there's scholars and there's academics, but I actually consider you all makers and so connected to communities and worlds that you work in. So for me, it's really been like a portal between the academy and scholarship, as well as this very deep community led work. So I'm hoping that will resonate in the way that the book goes out into the world. It is with MIT Press, which is an academic press, but it's coming out as a trade book. So it is also has a hope of reaching more than just the people interested in the footnotes. I guess to lead on that, I think the book is an imperfect offering. I mean, as soon as it's written, it has this kind of finality to it. And I appreciate Mary's comments about the impermanence of this work and how we need to continue evolving and building and changing as the work continues. So in that way, I hope that the work, gets out and gets shared, but also continues to grow and evolve. This is really only the beginning. And as Duke Redberg so generously told us, wisdom has not been taught in our systems, in our schools. And so that's why I do think the book is important in our education systems. And we do need to think about very much how this work can be brought more deeply into curricula and perhaps other forms of education, because wisdom is not on the curriculum. And that's a big problem. So I'll leave it there and pass it to William, and maybe we can open it up to the whole group. I think this is a big question that needs everyone.
Yeah, just a couple of comments, but indeed, let's open it up. The book, I think, it's an interesting problem because it's this category doesn't exist. There isn't a discipline that this plugs into. There isn't a ready-made market that this book addresses. And that's the terms that the publishing industry thinks about it within. That's the terms that reviewers think about it within. So it is a challenge to find a way to get this out there. That said, the book is really strong on offering tactics and strategies, really concrete ways of sort of doing this stuff. It's, I think, pretty strong in terms of offering a vocabulary and framing strategies to think about this. So the elements are all there, but how to connect it to those communities is a really good question. And maybe if any of you have suggestions, this is the moment to speak. Would love to hear them. Turn on your cameras, join us.
Well, my gosh, I think you've made a great start in that in just a week or so, you're going to be taking the book to IDFA, the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam, and it is going to be part of the swag bag of every person who is registered. And most of those are going to be filmmakers, media makers, industry makers. I think it's a very fantastic start, and I hope that it will begin a global conversation, or at least continue what's become a global conversation.
If I can add something in the how we move this out, this kind of thinking outside of the academy, I do think it is through education at all levels, because one of the things I find is that when talking to students, again, this can be secondary, this can be post-secondary, we tend to value the work they do individually, of course, because we're assessing, we're evaluating. But the second they leave that institution, they work as part of a team. But the way we teach people to work in part of a team is we say, you are a team, go. And we don't sort of acknowledge that it's hard, it's complicated, trust and mistrust and language, communication styles. So I do teach one class that involves this with students from across any field, and different departments maybe have different ways. Like filmmakers probably know how to work in a team, but with hierarchical roles. Engineers do not, even though every engineer will work with a project manager, will work with a designer, will work with a marketing team. And so I do think we need to build this kind of thinking at every level. This book has a media maker thread through a lot of the examples, but the impact of it is far beyond a single field, I think. And that's going to be an important lesson for all of us. And, everyone listening who I know is on board with these things, to push into a lot of fields, because the conversations aren't happening everywhere equally.
Vivek, I'm going to throw it over to you because there may be some questions out there, and the rest of the panel, of course, chime in whenever.
So I guess, we have just a little bit of time left, and there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'll get to. And before that, I was just really struck by the invocation of Grace Lee Boggs and Louis, your invocation as love your invocation of love as a value, which of course is central to the political transformative political work that Grace Lee Boggs devoted her life to. And it's making me, especially in light of this last comment, Richard, about also the messiness of co-creative processes, the kind of conflict and difficulties that one works through. What strikes me about co-creation is not just that the end product is a co-created piece of media or a co-created product, whatever. It's the end point is also the people, right? The transformation of the people through that process, right? It's the end product of a co-creative process is a different a set of people who've gone through a transformative process, right? And potentially a community and a larger community as it ripples outwards, right? And that does go back to things like questions of accountability and how when conflict arises within processes, how are people accountable? How do people move forward together? At the end of that kind of a process, that is about transformation, right? Human transformation. And I just wanted to throw that out as a kind of idea or question or something that, to people, for all of you to reflect upon and maybe talk about a little bit, at this stage in the conversation.
I'll just jump in briefly about this question of how we're transformed in the process. And one of the main goals of making a project is not just the media project, but the process and the relationships. And so the work that we've been developing through Reimagine is really about centering how those conversations happen early and often. Like, how do you ground your work in values and principles? Are you discussing early, before you start the project, who will be your facilitator or mediator if any kind of disagreement pops off? How are you discussing non-negotiables and values? Are there different political discussions you need to have, let's say about abolition or about, sexual violence or abuse, or about how you navigate, boycotting Zionist entities? All those things need to happen early, so you're not, in your distribution phase and realizing there's a big split between your whole team, right, about these fundamental values, right? And so we're encouraging folks to have those conversations early and document them, and have that be something that, in our opinion, is something we need to advocate for funders and for studios and for any resource gatekeepers to support, because that is quite a heavy lift of a process that people are often expected to do on their own voluntarily for free, but that take, especially from our community members featured in our projects, that don't come from like you said, academic environments or media jobs, that affords them the time to do that very sometimes in-depth conversation type work, relationship building work, that we need to be able to support and stipend people's time to participate in those in-depth processes. So to me, some of this work is about, pressuring the holders of the purse strings, to be able to redistribute resources and value that relationship building and those hard conversations as central to the work, and not just the media making in front of a computer or in front of a camera. Like, that's the only real work.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Il just said. With our Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling, we got a grant from the Heinz Foundation to do a family album of Pittsburgh and engage all these various cultural institutions across the city. And, and it's interesting, in thinking about a comment earlier around the hierarchy with regards to working in teams in terms of film. And I think the important thing, as Il mentioned, is to be able to pay these institutions, institutions which may be really grassroots versus these larger like museums or educational institutions, and that is part of that work, facilitating a certain equivalency, and thinking about like different entities having different types of cultural and social capital. And to be able to like reframe things, even as we're reframing like the history of Pittsburgh through these different lenses, through these different communities, whether they be ethnic or queer communities, or different classes, it's really important to think about like co-creation across institutions, as well as what a previous panel has mentioned. And so that idea of transformation for me is so important, and it's also connected with love, because it's like my intention when I make my various projects, when I engage with other people, is a certain sense of love and self-care and self-respect, and also to allow for to be vulnerable, that I'm not perfect. I can stumble, but I'm also accountable.
Kat, you had your hand up a second ago.
Well, I was going to throw it to Thomas, so
oh,
he did the work.
Should I throw it to someone?
No, why don't I, in the last few minutes that we have, there is a question that came earlier on from Sandra Gaudenzi, who many of you I'm sure know, and that is in relation to co-creation with non-human systems. Sandra writes, I totally agree with the idea of different types of intelligence, but within collective authorship, do we not assume that all the agents want to be part of such collective effort? It seems to me that in most examples I have seen, it is only us having the initiative. Does this still count as co-creation?
I'm going to ask Amelia to answer that.
Thank you. I don't know if I have a really good answer to that, but I really like that people are starting to think of how you want to participate and show up. And I think that's really important. Just because we're collectively doing something together, it should never mean we're all doing the same thing. I hate doing things I don't like to do. I don't want to do the same things that everyone else does on a project. I have things that I'm very good at. I have things that other people are so much better than I am at. And I think collectively working together, collaborating and co-creating really offers us the ability to show up as ourselves with the unique abilities that each one of us has and that we feel called to share. And I hope that changes throughout someone's lifetime. The things that I wanted to do 10 years ago and things I want to do today are very different. And the same with many of my students who are here in the audience. Sometimes the ways in which they entered this university and the ways that they leave, I hope are different. I hope that they see the world in a new way. I hope that they want to contribute to the world in new ways. And I hope that they're always learning and they're always growing. And in that way, you can say, I show up and I'm co-creating. And I hope that in a year and in 2 years, it's in a different format and it will always be valued and it'll always be respected. And I'll always be asked what I want to offer and it will never be assumed. And so I think that type of respect, which many of us have talked about, is so key and important to collaborating. I think people get nervous when they say, okay, all of us are going to decide everything, because we've seen situations, we've all been parts of groups where they say the group is deciding, and yet we don't feel as though it's transparent. We don't feel as though, I didn't really want to do that, so why are we doing it, right? And so those systems need to be transparent and they need to be able to be opt-in and opt-out. We need to be able to say, I want to work in the beginning of this project and then I trust this. And please let me go and be with my family and focus on other projects. And I've given what I need to give and respect that. And so I think so much of that is around transparency and respect.